Okay, so let me introduce Alyson Brickey, and then Alyson, you will introduce Karen and her book. So Alyson is assistant professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, where she teaches and writes about American literature, transatlantic modernism, and critical theory. Her work can be found in Studies in the Novel, Journal of Modern Literature, and Walt Whitman Quarterly Review. She's currently at work on a book-length project entitled Frightful Wrongs and Beautiful Things: How Jim Crow Shaped American Modernism. So Alyson, thank you so much for accepting to have a conversation with Karen about her book, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Marianne. It's so nice to actually put a face to your name, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to participate in this conference, and especially to be able to have a conversation with my wonderful colleague, Karen Zoppa. I think many of you can probably relate that sometimes the people who work down the hall are the people that you see the least somehow. So it's really nice. I see some other colleagues here, so it's wonderful to be here. So I'll just introduce Karen and her wonderful book here quickly for everyone before we get into my questions. So it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about Karen Zoppa's 2021 book, Playing the Scene of Religion, Beauvoir and Faith. This is published with Equinox Press. I have worked with Karen before on our faculty union, so it's wonderful to be able to discuss her research with her, as I think we have many research interests in common. Karen teaches here at the University of Winnipeg in the departments of philosophy, religion and culture, and in the collegiate division. Her work focuses on philosophers Simone de Beauvoir and Jacques Derrida, as well as the critical theory of religion. So the book we will be discussing today was also shortlisted for the 2022 American Academy of Religion Book Awards. She has also contributed an article on Beauvoir to the forthcoming Dictionnaire du non-religieux, forthcoming with PUF in 2025, as well as the chapter Force of Law, Resources in Derrida for Rethinking Policing in Discourses in Crisis, edited by Lauren Griffin and forthcoming also from Equinox in 2025. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you, everybody. I echo everything that you've said, Alyson. I want to thank the Beauvoir Society for giving me this opportunity to discuss my book, especially Rouch, who's just done a spectacular job organizing this online conference so beautifully. And I'm very happy to see so many of my colleagues on the steering committee and from the University of Winnipeg here. So what would you like to know, Alyson?
Excellent. I have so many questions and was so excited reading this book. So thank you for indulging me with how long some of these questions are. And we might not get through all of them. So answer as many or as few as you'd like. And just so excited to be able to talk to you about this book. So I thought we could start by thinking through what I think is a really fascinating methodology that you've undertaken with this text. So you are taking as your point of departure this kind of consistent scholarly cultural framing of Beauvoir as an atheist or someone who explicitly rejected religion in order to produce her philosophical work. And instead, you are kind of recontextualizing her for us, both historically, by reminding us of the particular French Catholic liberal bourgeois manifestation of religion that she did explicitly reject, and then by refracting her work through the work of Derrida and Certeau very elegantly. And these are two thinkers who I think you prove provide us with a more capacious and nuanced and productive definition of what religion might be. So here you are thinking of religion as a scene, as you take this language from Derrida, a scene of play of particular mobile forces, rather than a kind of universalist static thing that we can refer to. And I'd love to just open by asking you to talk a bit about how the book came to be and what drew you to putting this really interesting triumvirate of thinkers together.
Oh, that's such a great question. Can I just check, am I audible? You can hear me
Yeah.
all right? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have trouble with my mic. How they came together in this book is in part happenstance of who I was working with at the time that I was devising a thesis for my PhD. And my advisor was the distinguished professor at the University of Manitoba, Don McCants, who was the founder and editor of the journal called Mosaic, which is pretty much devoted to various iterations of deconstruction and postmodern thought. So I'd been studying Derrida. Pardon me. I'd been studying Derrida with her quite intensely for a couple of years. And one day, out of the blue, she said, what do you think of Simone de Beauvoir? And I said, oh, I love her. I've been reading her since I was 16. And she said, good. I want you to talk to my colleague, Louise René. Some of you may know Dr. Louise René from her work with the Society. And so strangely, I shifted gears from a Derrida focus to working with Louise René on Beauvoir, but I couldn't shake Derrida. And the more I read Beauvoir as a philosopher, I had read her novels all my life and was, just enthralled by her writing and her insight into women, politics, etc. So what happened was, as I'm reading her philosophically now, exposed to texts I'd never read before, I could not shake the ways in which she is saying things in her own idiom that Derrida is also constantly thematically addressing. So it just seemed natural to me that there might be a connection there, and I'm continuing to explore this contextually as well. So then, in the course of looking at a thesis on the role of religion in the thought of Beauvoir, I was also studying critical theory of religion, and what I had learned in this several years of deep dive into contemporary theory is that Derrida is a wonderful synthesis of much of the contemporary thinking about what do we mean when we talk about religion. So he provided a perfect entree for one of the spokes of my thesis wheel, and the serendipitous intersticing of the way he thinks about philosophy and the way Beauvoir thinks about philosophy. It just seemed to me natural to bring them together. Certeau was a later addition that one of my advising committee brought to me, and I just thought that because of Beauvoir's marvelous and lifelong, I'll say, interest in and instruction from the mystic tradition, he seemed to be another wonderful spoke in this wheel. So that's sort of the long answer to the long question.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think that it feels to me like such an organic connection, and it's neat to hear how it came to be behind the scenes as well. And also was introduced to like some of the biographical details that you map out early in the book between the three figures. I think also weaves their lives together in really wonderful ways.
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
glad you mentioned. Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I'm glad
No,
you mentioned
go.
that
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they literally, were walking the same streets at the same time for a period of about a decade and a half in Paris, and yeah, there is definitely a direct contact between Certeau and Derrida. They read each other, and I think it's impossible not to read Certeau as being influenced by of grammatology and other Derridian works. The Beauvoir connection, though, is much more just inferential. I can't prove anything, but I'm on a hunt to try to
Love
see,
that.
if there is something there. I mean, it seems to me that it's not just an accident that Derrida is so often echoing, resonating things that Beauvoir has already thought maybe 25 years before. So,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Wonderful. No, thank you. Please do anytime. Okay. So my second question is delving a little bit more into what I think is the impressively rigorous work you do around Derridian concepts in this book. I think I've worked on Derrida a little bit, and I think that it can be quite rare to see somebody explicate some of his concepts in such a clear way that doesn't kind of reduce his concepts. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and whether that, like, how that process is for you, kind of figuring out some of these foundational Derridian concepts. And in chapter 2 specifically, I thought I'd ask you about this chapter is called Setting the Scene, which is a really fundamental concept for your book, this idea of a scene, of play. And you accomplish in this chapter a really cogent explanation of how Derrida, who's always working from a longer tradition. I always tell my students, when you open up Derrida, you have to open up all the other books as well. And who he's kind of working from Kant here. And he's exposing the play between faith, or the absence of knowledge, and knowledge, or the condition of not needing faith, in this scene of religion. And I'll just quote here from page 33. You write, "There is no opposition between faith and knowledge, between religion and reason, because both are implicated in the same play between, on the one hand, indemnifying certain truths, and on the other hand, promising to believe those truths, even if they might be perjuries or lies." And I think this goes to, like, sort of the heart of the kind of Derridian deconstruction of notions of truths and knowledge. And you go on to connect this even back to the play between light and darkness in Plato's cave, which I thought was so wonderfully done. And then you go back towards the Enlightenment to kind of expose this desire to really keep these two categories separate, which Derrida is undermining here. And I'm interested in how this particular complication between this distinction between faith and knowledge was so foundational to and so central to your approach in how you came to understand Beauvoir sort of in a fresh or different way through this kind of concept.
Oh, another great question. Well, I would say that if I am a successful reader of Derrida, to the degree that I might be successful, I think it's largely because of my understanding of Beauvoir. I think Beauvoir's thesis of ambiguity, her axiom of ambiguity, is a different way of expressing difference. And I think that the thing about Beauvoir and Derrida that helps me think them together is they're both Hegelian scholars. They're both deep thinkers of Hegel. And in a way, I think that what they're doing is they're iterating Hegelian dialectic without his metaphysical commitments. And I think that, you know, once I found that connection between them, Beauvoir to me is a less dense writer, although she is a very dense writer. And she enabled me to start to sort of hover above the scene of Derrida's writing and go, oh, now I see what's going on here. So yeah, I find that very, very satisfying, thinking them together. As for the theme of faith and knowledge, when I said earlier that I think Derrida's book, Faith and Knowledge, the two sources of religion at the limit of reason alone, I think it is probably the most effective synthesis of the best critical theory of religion in the last 30 years. I don't know that I could say or draw direct bibliographical support for that claim, but I do know as I read that book, which he is very much following that trajectory that you've just described, Alyson, from Kant back to Plato and then forward to us now. As I read that book, he is iterating all of the major insights of scholarship in recent decades. And his main point, for those of you who obviously haven't read my book yet, he's really trying to establish that, you know, religion is only a category that is properly spoken of with respect to Christianity. It is a Latin Christian concept. And that is something that, of course, is not contained. It exceeds its own margins because you can't speak of Christianity without speaking of Greece. You can't even speak of Christianity without speaking of Judaism, and of course, Persia and India. I mean, it explodes exponentially. But he starts there with that idea that religion is a Christian word. It is a Christian concept. It was inherited from the Roman world. And those forces that construct imperial Rome and then imperial Roman Christianity are still at play today. That's really his thesis. So I was very much just being a good reader of Derrida there. Now, interestingly, again, in Beauvoir, she retains, or not retains, it's the wrong word. She is also engaged with the same insights, but I would say several decades before Derrida. And she understands that it's that wonderful quote from Peggy Camus, the forces that compose are also the same forces that will annihilate. And Beauvoir is very much aware of that, that tension and play in these historical contexts we find ourselves in. I don't know if I actually answered your question, so continue on.
I think you did. I think you did wonderfully. Thank you. Yeah, maybe to talk more about that too, this idea of a concept that we're kind of stuck having to use, but nevertheless continues to exceed its own margins. I kind of see you doing justice to this excess as you're writing about religion throughout, and you're kind of in your methodology, you're thinking too about the way that intellectual confluences or inheritances seem in your book to run in many different directions. Like, I found this so fascinating to think not just in a kind of linear, progressive, teleological way about like the development of intellectual concepts or philosophical concepts, but actually having the freedom to move in many different directions through time, which I think in your book results in some quite original insights. So you're not just consulting Derrida and Certeau in order to reframe Beauvoir's earlier writings, but you're also sort of suggesting that many of her concepts are present in their work. And then also Beauvoir actually helps us redefine what we mean when we say this kind of insufficient word religion, and can expose a kind of disciplinary etymology in your own field, which for me as an English scholar was really enlightening to read about and understand better through your book. And thinking about how that vocabulary over time has often foreclosed what could be a more politically urgent avenue of perceiving what religion is in many aspects of human life. So you connect it to strivings for justice and different social formations, for example, and especially in the last chapter, you really, I think, make a case for the relevance of conceiving of this broader sense of what religion is and continues to be in the world. So I thought I'd ask you as well about Beauvoir as a figure and how you see her work as containing maybe some untapped potential for better understanding our current moment, our current world.
Well, thank you. Yes, briefly, as you've already alluded to, my thesis in the book is that the existential atheist position that Beauvoir occupies is impossible without this thing, religion, that I am arguing is a very particular array of forces that emerge out of the Holy Roman Empire and that continue to deploy in global capitalism today. And it is a beautiful case of resisting. The organism resists that which threatens it, and in that resistance produces a new synthesis, a new thing. And Beauvoir's existential atheism is one of those things. But what I really love about Beauvoir is that she is always honoring, always inheriting, in a way that Derrida would totally say, yes, that's exactly what we must do. She's always taking that from the past, which is worthy, which is worth continuing to honor, and she's iterating it again in a new way. And faith is the thing that I think we need to attend to in Beauvoir, and many Beauvoir scholars are doing this in applying her ethic to contemporary situation. Um, I'm glad that you were sensitive to that possibility for justice in Beauvoir. I think that her insistence, which I think also people who are not existential atheists could even embrace, her insistence on the inescapable fact of faith between ourselves with the other, the opening to the other, that she insists is the foundation of any meaning in our lives. If we do take that seriously, if we do embrace that and its possibilities, um, when I look at the program of this conference, there's not one topic in this conference that would not benefit and is benefiting from a kind of reading with Beauvoir's ethic to to um, to try to mitigate some of the injustices that naturally emerge in this authoritarian hierarchical construct we live in.
So beautifully said, Karen. Thank you for that. I was quickly flipping to find this quote that I loved from page 122, where you write, inheriting the past here cannot mean an uncritical reproduction of untenable ontologies and the tyranny of blind authority. And I just was so struck by this phrasing, reading this book now and thinking about the urgency of some of these topics. So thank you for that. Okay, my next question is about feminism. So I was really interested in this book, that Beauvoir's feminism was in some refreshing way just taken as a given. It wasn't like the main focus of your inquiry, and you are sort of implicitly approaching her as a feminist philosopher and ethicist, but it doesn't necessarily focus on that, or isn't contained on in her feminism as its only interest. Was this a deliberate choice for you? And I'm also, as a kind of side question, interested in whether you were tempted at all to reach for some of, for example, Derrida's explicit critiques of patriarchy in, of grammatology, like phallogocentrism and concepts like that. Were you kind of pulled that way at any point? Did you kind of decide not to, or how did you kind of grapple with her as a feminist figure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I was tempted because of the focus of the book was really doing an interrogation of concept of religion and how I see Beauvoir as an actor within that interrogation. And the other, even if I don't think I was tempted, but Beauvoir's feminism is itself under interrogation right now. I think perhaps we can say that, Maureen. Do you agree? um, um, it's been cracked open in many ways by new developments, new historical developments in our global world. And I think it's less easy to talk about Beauvoir's feminism in a simple way. Let's put it that way. Yeah, she's become a controversial figure from some precincts. She's often claimed by this group or that group in ways that they do not agree with one another. So yeah, I would have to say that, number one, I wasn't tempted, and number two, I would be cautious if I were tempted. And as for Derrida's critique of phallogocentrism and patriarchy, it to me that piece is already implicit in his critique of the hierarchical authoritarian drive to indemnification. To me, that's all of a piece, but yeah, it could be teased out more for sure.
No, I think you're right. I think it's there. I think it's there in the critique of, like, the patriarchal figures that he's undermining with this theory of religion, obviously. Yeah. Or the kind of like mythologies of that. Yeah. Okay. Also, I learned so much about Certeau reading this book that I didn't know. So it was really awesome for me, particularly to read that section of the book. And I didn't know anything about this, but you focused on Certeau's writing about mysticism in particular, which you mentioned a little bit in the opening, as well as his concept of the absent other, which you write about so beautifully in this book. And you link this to an undermining within the philosophical and cultural tradition itself of patriarchal authority. So this kind of linking back to what you were just implicitly saying. And this opens into Beauvoir's thinking so organically in your book, I thought. So I know you said it was a bit of a later addition to include Certeau in this text, but can you talk a little bit about, and I'll quote here, you say, Certeau's writing reveals that, quote, mystic utterance is itself an interrogation of the scene of religion, and its proximity to Beauvoir anticipates her arrival. And how you kind of see, how you eventually ended up seeing the two kind of working so well together in your book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, The Mystic Fable is a book that I'll probably continue reading for the rest of my life. It's just magisterial. Certeau was primarily a historian, but he was a philosopher as well, deeply well-read reader of Hegel, I should say. And in this study, there are a number of different registers that he's interested in exposing in this study. But above all, he's looking at the fabula that's created about mysticism, I think almost as a response from the Ecclesia, from the church itself, after the sort of fact of this resistance within these certain quarters. And he's also looking at the way that it ends up being deployed sometimes in the service of patriarchy, in the service of the authority of the church. And yet, I don't know how familiar you are with Certeau, but he describes himself as someone who is examining heterologies. You know, the discourse of the other is what really grabs Certeau. And what I think he found delightful in his excavation of this history of the mystic is the way in which, despite the co-opting by the church authority of the mystic fable and mysticism, the wanderers, as he puts it, would still resist. They would escape. They would, get away from this attempt again to make them move no more. Be still. Do what we tell you. Toe the line. Hold the thing sacred. So the true mystic for Certeau is one that is never satisfied. And I found him really quite delightful in his embracing of what we'll call apophasis, where you cannot say what it is, but you can certainly identify what it is not, whatever it may be. So where's the tangent between Certeau and Beauvoir? Well, she writes about this just over and over again in her autobiographical writings, and in her philosophy about one of the ambiguities of our human condition is that we do long for this kind of transcendent absolute union with the other at the same time that we recognize the impossibility of this, or at least somebody who doesn't accept metaphysical propositions or commitments would have to reject that. So when I first read his opening pages of the Mystic Fable, where he says very much the same thing, I thought, oh yeah, we have to try to think Beauvoir in the context of Certeau, and her own insights into the mystic tradition were so spot on. His historical and philosophical rendering of that reiterates much of what Beauvoir herself says, not just in The Second Sex, where she devotes a chapter to mysticism, but also in her many autobiographical writings. So yeah, she not only does she intellectually is she able to conceptualize these things, but she herself was attracted to what we'll call the mystic practice. She was attracted to the idea as an embodied singular consciousness, trying to allow herself, or yeah, I guess allow herself to follow this desire, this unending desire, as Certeau describes it. Yeah, she herself, in her own historical situation, her contextual situation, she possessed many of the same markers as those mystics that Certeau is studying in the 16th and 17th century. Often these people were born to impoverished nobility. Usually they were women, intelligent women, who were, quite clear on what was not speaking to them anymore within the context of Roman Catholic culture, to put it that way. And she also resisted that inauthenticity. She resisted hegemony, and she resisted being told to swallow so-called capital T truths that no longer spoke to her, at the same time that she was forever hopeful that there was something worth yearning for. And the story of Beauvoir's thought, I think, is really the story of her coming to articulate very carefully in her ethics of ambiguity, and in Pyrrhus and Simius, amongst other places, this idea that the longing doesn't have to have an indemnified object. The longing is enough in itself. And I think that, Certeau's description of the mystics would support that. I think I've gone off topic.
Not at
So
all. You're
steer me back.
you're very much on topic. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you. And I look forward to picking up that Certeau book. I only know the Practice of Everyday Life, so I'm very excited to read about this. But yeah, I love the way that you're kind of like characterizing her thinking, and then her connection back to some of those really important figures, mystic figures.
Yeah, you know what's really
women. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but what's really
Yeah.
interesting to me is she's just so relentlessly intellectually honest, and having been, thoroughly and inundated with Roman Catholic, um, education, religious education, as she would say later on. She very bluntly and openly and joyfully will still quote John of the Cross, or she will quote
Mhm.
Teresa of Avila, or oh my goodness, I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, there's a lot of these wonderful authoritative mystic writers that she will still invoke, because she sees that even in the rejection of their metaphysical commitments, if they have any to reject, she still sees merit and truth in their process. Yeah. What did she say?
Yeah.
John of the Cross. She was fond of quoting John of the Cross. The only way to go the way that one does not know is to go the way one does not know.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, I'm gonna skip a question here that I had, just because I think it's like relevant to what you were just talking about. You make this really fascinating claim near the end of the book, that Beauvoir is an agent of autoimmunity, and you're taking this concept from Derrida, who resists, quote, the very truth she was enlisted to protect. I think this is really related to the kind of intellectual honesty that you were just talking about, that we can trace in her work, and that you bring out so wonderfully in conversation with these other theorists. I was wondering whether you would say also that the kind of maybe common reading of Beauvoir, or many readings of Beauvoir over the years, as a kind of maybe anti-faith, anti-religion, atheist, ethicist, might itself be some kind of autoimmune response from the scholarly world. Does her work kind of demand a tolerance for ambiguity on the part of the critic, who must refuse to categorize her as either traditionally religious or traditionally atheist, in order to really see her clearly and do justice to that fundamental ambiguity that exists in her oeuvre?
Wow. Spot on, Alyson. Yes. I mean, and that's, yes, her demand that we acknowledge and honor ambiguity, the fact of ambiguity, and be sensitive to the many ways in which ambiguity expresses itself. I mean, it's unavoidable. It's ubiquitous. It is really the condition, the condition of our existence. And yes, I think very much so. And this is a real question for me that I'm interested in pursuing, the way in which we are so easily driven to the position of resisting. Even you achieve a critical insight, and we're so easily drawn into indemnifying that insight and then resisting the new one that comes along, or an older one that is reasserted. It seems to be the nature of our organism. There's an analogy I could use that helps me understand this concept. That a cell will, it has a protective layer around itself, and when it perceives threat, cells do perceive, it pushes out with this protective layer to keep itself from being disturbed. And ironically, it ends up disturbing itself in the motion of protecting itself. And I think that that's unavoidable. And I don't think it's a problem. I think it's just something that needs to be suffered. Yeah, we have to suffer these kinds of resistances, both to our own insights and also against our insights. So yes, in terms of critical response to Beauvoir at present, I think the whole topic of religion itself is problematic in philosophy in general. There is a real resistance in philosophical discourse to the interrogation of religion, and I think we'll continue to see this kind of autoimmune process unfolding for quite some time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm aware of the time and that I need to open it up here for, I'm sure people have many comments and questions for you. I thought I'd ask you one quick last question, which is if you could talk to us a little bit about what you're working on next.
Oh. Well, I'm actually taking a bit of a rest, but I am actually developing a philosophy of religion course that will I hope will be able to also engage Beauvoir. It's not obviously going to be a traditional philosophy of religion course. It's going to look at the tradition, the ontological argument for the existence of God and all of that wonderful, historically grounded stuff, and then look at what's been happening in critical theory of religion. So I intend to incorporate my Beauvoir scholarship into that presentation.
Wonderful. Lucky students. I look forward to hearing about this course. Thank you so much, Karen. That was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it and learned so much.
Oh, thank you, Alyson.
Marine, let's open it up to others. Dana, or yeah.
Yeah, also hand claps. Thank you so much, Karen. And also, I'm originally from the Fargo-Moorhead area, so it's
hi. Yay.
Yeah, fun times in Winnipeg as a teenager, as you might imagine.
And I love Fargo.
It's an interesting place. So I have two questions for you. So first, I wanted to follow up on your kind of gesture towards Beauvoir and contested feminism. So, I've got Megan Burke's great book here, right, which is tackling that on like head on, at least one of the many things, right, where the gender critical folks are appropriating Beauvoir to ground their turfiness, right? And so Megan is one of several voices like really articulating the way that this is a misread, really and doing good work to address that sort of thing. So I was curious to just, I guess, more, because that's where my mind went. So if you have other contested feminisms in your mind, but for me, that is currently the most pressing one politically for us. And so I'm curious how this inquiry into faith, religion, Beauvoir's ambivalent relationship to it maybe helps us think about her work vis-a-vis TERFs, vis-a-vis, right? So I don't know, we just have a new Supreme Court ruling that came out here in the United States just an hour or two ago, upholding the gender affirming care ban in Tennessee.
Oh, no, no.
Yeah. So, right. So this is very pressing. So, and that's all, of course, as you know, tied up in the United States with issues about religion, right? Really enforcing a kind of binary, so-called biological view. And so I'm curious how this sort of inquiry into Beauvoir and religion can maybe be helpful for us in thinking that particular problem with contested feminisms. And so that's my first question. The second question is maybe a quicker one. So I did have a chance to very briefly look at your book. I haven't read it yet, but I did do a quick index search and notice that there's no Kierkegaard entry. And so I'm curious, to learn more about that, especially since it is Beauvoir and Derrida. They both have their own kind of relationship to that figure, different relationships perhaps, but that is my second question. So the first one's, yeah.
Right, great question. And yeah, I think I actually haven't read Megan's book. I have read reviews of it, and I am tangentially aware of the turf war that you're referring to. So that was exactly what I was thinking of. Yes, I've recently, well, I guess about a year ago, I wrote a paper about how Beauvoir can help us think about decolonization, which is another one of those concepts that I think is in need of interrogation because it's used in a very, I think, imprecise and perhaps troubling manner. And so I'll sort of say some of the things I said in respect to that. That's a terrible piece of news about the Supreme Court. At the core of Beauvoir's ethic is which she locates in our relationship to the other. Everything, what does she say? I concern others and they concern me. Here we have an irrefutable truth. At the same time that we are singular and that our singularity, our rights, our inherent dignity as individuals must be honored and respected and upheld. It can only be done so in relation to the other and how we treat with one another, how we respond to the appeal of the other. And I think her very carefully phrased iteration of the categorical imperative, that I treat the other as a freedom so that their end may be freedom. I think that to me remains a guiding principle. And the problem, well, I mean, as an outsider, I say this cautiously, but I think one of the problems in the United States is the embedding of a kind of calcification of the rule of law that is based on this authoritarian imperial tradition, patriarchal tradition, the indemnification of that and the embedding of that in so much of the American political and legal landscape is probably going to make it more challenging to see an evolution towards the kind of law that could emanate from Beauvoir's dictum. But that's where I see she's helpful to us in thinking through these things. There is a good tradition of political theory, of social justice theory, European and North American, that I think could support us taking this idea seriously. But in the meantime, I think we have a big problem with the law as it is written in the United States today is all about reinforcing and reproducing the power of the ancient patriarchy. So I think Beauvoir is relevant on a number of levels. One, her her broader feminist analysis of the social construction of identity and the play of power therein. And then I think her ethic could be very useful to us. That's a very broad answer, but that's my first take on what you were saying. If I'm not on point, please ask more. Okay, and then your second question, I've sort of forgotten how you worded it.
Yeah, well, so I just took a very brief look at your book before this conference. So I haven't read it, but I did, take a peek at the index. And so I noticed that there was no entry for Soren Kierkegaard. So
Right.
so I was just curious why.
Yes. Well, for the purpose of my interrogation of the concept of religion, what Beauvoir had to say about Kierkegaard wasn't immediately relevant, I think, to that discussion. Derrida treats, pardon me, I do mention Kierkegaard in that Derrida takes Kierkegaard's reading of the Abraham and Isaac story in, I think it's in Fear and Trembling, if I'm not mistaken. He takes that as exemplary discussion of Abraham's commanded by an unseen, unknown other to do this, what Derrida calls abominable sacrifice of that which he loves most. And he uses that to amplify and lift up his understanding of what we mean by faith. But other than that, because I was quoting Derrida, I didn't quote Kierkegaard, obviously. And yeah, I didn't really see a big place for it in this discussion. And I'd be really interested to know, what you thought was what you would like to see happen there. I would be very interested in any insight into Beauvoir's take on Kierkegaard that you think would be relevant there.
So I have an article in Hypatia 2023 on Beauvoir's use of Kierkegaard. And I'm trying to develop it into a book. So very interested in her appropriation of the concept of repetition and faith, but done in this, more feminist, secular kind of context. So it is out in print already. And then there, maybe more as well, but she did also take Kierkegaard very seriously.
Oh, yes.
And so, yeah, so because of that, and because of the resonance that you're exploring with Derrida, I was curious, why perhaps not a thing, but maybe it's just because of the published, all the things are happening at once and, yeah.
No, I think that's so exciting. And I definitely going to look up your article, and I think it's definitely a thread in Beauvoir that needs attention. And yeah, thank you.
I won't take up more time. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
We'll go to Timothy next.
Timothy?
I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, at the moment I went to unmute myself, I lost my Zoom screen. So, so thank you so much, Karen, both for your book and for your presentation. I'm working my way through it, and I'm writing on similar topics, so it's very informative, very insightful. I suppose that maybe I could just ask the big question, which is like, one of the problems that's very clear that you're articulating and giving us resources to address is that the category of religion is bound up in the problem of alterity, right? So that we in a sense always use our own religious vocabulary to describe religion, but then in so doing, we haven't described religion, which aspires to be about something more than just a religion. So this sort of that difficult conceptual space, I really appreciate you working there. But I think in particular, these things become sort of really attenuated when you start talking concretely about what these religious concepts mean to people. And so I was thinking a lot during your presentation about the category of man and woman and the differences between, for example, the Hebraic and the Greek inheritance of these terms. And I'm sort of just inviting you to speculate on how is it that you think in particular for a feminist for a researcher who has so much to say about the category of woman, how does this religious reading of Beauvoir maybe refract or alter how we might think about those categories as religious categories?
Yeah, I think I take very seriously my thesis that religion is the historical forces that continue to operate in the global capitalist world today. And when we talk about categories like man or woman, we're talking about how they've been constructed in that tradition. And that tradition, of course, exceeds what is commonly called religion, which people associate with, places of worship and rituals, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we can divorce the categories as we are given them in our contemporary societies from that long history and that power structure. We're still stuck with it, and those. Well, probably there are classicists who would disagree with me, but I think they're largely, again, shaped and continuously repeated, very much out of the Greek and Hebrew patriarchies that inform Christianity. So I don't know how we can escape that. I think a nice counterpoint, to make that more evident is, let's just look at Anishinaabe culture, at its traditions, pre-colonial traditions, its understandings of, I don't even know if the word gender would work there, but I guess we'll say gender roles and the fluidity with which gender is regarded. Anishinaabe people are the people of where I live in Winnipeg, Canada. I guess they're called Cree and Ojibwe more popularly. And you contrast that understanding, that fluid understanding of role and less prescribed understanding of sexuality, and contrast that with the more narrow and prescriptive inheritance from this Roman imperial tradition. And I think that makes it clear what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I'm almost at the point after doing this book where when I hear the word religion, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, sort of like a ridgeback. And I'm always sort of seeing things through the lens of that critique. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my first response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions, comments? I forget what time we have to end, Marine. Is it right about now? I'm trying to remember.
Can you hear me? Okay, yes. We still have 5 minutes, so if there are more questions, if you, Alyson, want to ask one more question, or we can.
Oh,
it's up to you.
I did have one question that I didn't ask. That's a totally selfish question, but I love the through line in your book of the other and alterity and Beauvoir's ethics, as you've said so beautifully in this talk today, are so dedicated to openness to alterity. And I just wondered if you were interested in the work of Emmanuel Levinas at all, and whether this came up for you at all when you were doing your research, and whether this is a relevant person to also put in conversation with Beauvoir.
Yes, I'm aware of a sort of controversial rub between Beauvoir and Levinas during her lifetime. But I am not a Levinas scholar. I know that he deeply informs Derrida. So I know about him, through secondary sources. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't really say too much about that thread. So yeah, it's a vacuum in my scholarship. I apologize.
We all have them. Thank you so much. Well, thank you again, Karen. This was just such a wonderful conversation, and it's such a wonderful book, and I hope everybody goes and picks it up. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful questions as well, everybody in the audience, and for the invitation to this great conference.
Indeed, and thank you, Alyson, for being just a stellar colleague and interviewer. And yeah, it was just great to see everybody. Okay, we'll continue on for the next few days. Yes.